En el momento en que decidamos decir sí a la minería, ese día vamos a decir sí a quitarnos la matriz y no volver a tener nunca más hijos. Pero si realmente somos mujeres, madres, hijas, abuelas, tenemos que defender lo nuestro.
Nos cogieron, nos secuestraron, nos golpearon terriblemente ahí.
Hace un mes que nos quemaron unas viviendas.
Llegan las policías, amenazan a todas las personas. Trabajadores de la empresa llegaron allá, mataron a un compañero y dejaron 2 heridos. Y esa es una tristeza para nosotros, porque sé que nosotros, por defender la madre tierra, tenemos que defender porque ese es el futuro.
Ese es el mapa de Ecuador. Toda la parte que está en rojo son las áreas de potencial minero de Ecuador. Ecuador está ahorita a la venta, así de simple, a la venta, ¿no? Al mejor postor. Y al interior hay una gran resistencia de las comunidades todavía, a pesar de la represión, a pesar de la persecución, a pesar de la criminalización.
Hemos tenido compañeras enjuiciadas, que están enjuiciadas por terrorismo organizado, pero si somos campesinas del pueblo, ¿cómo vamos a ser terroristas?
In 2007, after over 2 decades of national struggle by indigenous communities against neoliberalism, it appeared that the tide was turning. Popular mobilization had seen the removal of several presidents who had tried to force IMF and World Bank policies on the population. In 2006, Rafael Correa entered the presidency with the support of all social movements, indigenous, environmental, and human rights. The hope was that his triumph would take the country in a new direction and out of the instability that had paralyzed it for so long. Correa would enact a new constitution that committed the country to living well, a new way of looking at development that departs from the old models. It guarantees the rights of nature. Nature is a subject with rights in the constitution. Ecuador's constitution is the only one in the world with this characteristic. The constitution also notes that water is a fundamental human right. Not just access to water, but water itself. Water is a strategic patrimony. Water is part of biodiversity. It is central to nature. While Correa enacted a mining moratorium while his government introduced new water and mining laws, it had become clear that the policies that the government was introducing were based on other foundations. Foundations that did not respect the collective ideas and demands of the grassroots that had supported him. New mechanisms were emerging, yet the indigenous were absent. Indigenous peoples who had long been arguing for a sustainable development model that would break with the extractive model that we have today.
Ecuador tenga la reserva de cobre más grande del mundo. Lo mismo con el oro. Por supuesto, a todos nos duele ver que tal vez un cerro sea cortado con tanta vegetación, biodiversidad. ¿Acaso no será más inmoral dejar esos recursos tan necesarios para nuestro desarrollo, para nuestra educación, para nuestra salud?
Continuing, he says that the real threat lies among the infantile and fundamentalist environmental, indigenous, and leftist groups who are staunchly opposed to metal mining. Yet in Ecuador, agricultural production, communitarian agricultural production, has been one of the principal axes of well-being because these agricultural products meet the food needs of those living in cities. But now, investment is moving out of agriculture and going towards natural resource extraction. To understand why Ecuadorian society is so fundamentally divided and left with such limited options, we need to look to the structural problems created by its past. As Marx notes, the arrivals of the European colonial powers was at a time of great change in the world. Precious metals themselves were the medium of payment for Renaissance Europe. In all, figures suggest that the gold and silver extracted from Latin America functioned as the thrust for the Industrial Revolution. At its high point in the 18th century, over 50,000 pounds of gold was arriving in the city of London per week. Of the capital that remained on the continent, most was squandered by the foreign managers on European luxuries rather than on diversification. The devastation, though, was not just limited to the economy. Philip II of Spain noted that by 1581, a third of Indians had been wiped out, shattering the Inca Empire. Mines required massive displacement of people, forced labor claimed countless lives, and destroyed collective farming. Miners also turned to overconsumption of cocoa and pure alcohol as a cheap alternative to the food they could not afford, and to alleviate the misery of their work conditions. They were also forced off the land to arid mountains and in the middle of the deserts. While the Indian population as a whole suffered, colonization also brought a certain set of gender ideals that was pervasive through its institutions and would have a coercive effect on indigenous people to the detriment of women. As the peasant systems were merged with capitalist modes of production, modernization tendencies of the colonists would overcome traditional ideas in the area of resource control, leading to the reproduction of patriarchal socio-cultural systems. The end result being that women in the developing world would lose access to the means of production and to productive decision-making. Looking at the history of gender relations in Latin America, evidence has shown that pre-Inca elite women had access to land rights and inherited land. During Inca times, they held land rights that were the equivalent of men, and it has been suggested that they held economic roles of importance linking local to national government. Colonization, though, changed all this. At first, all Indians were considered wards of the state, losing control of land and labor, yet still having to work for the crown. In accordance with Spanish cultural norms, men were perceived to be the household head. In this context, even in the early independence period and the early 20th century, women could not inherit the small hacienda plots that they had farmed as a family, but they could still inherit the husband's debt. Contemporary times are no better. As colonial policy has been replaced by modernization techniques, there is still a neglect towards recognizing the work of women, as men are perceived to be responsible for agricultural production. In this context, Andean land reform has often excluded women. They need permission to act within local cooperatives and excluded with development projects. They are only rarely considered in reproductive roles. Men's production in capital markets has also served to reduce women's agricultural productivity and access to income and household status. Traditional communities had seen a sharing of roles, but in the absence of the husband, these roles have needed to be replaced to use income that is usually held by the male. The woman is also reduced in the status of the husband's eyes, having come into a social order that devalues those without access to capital. We also see a family breakdown and tension as women are left to do all the agricultural work, leaving no time for normal household work, while husbands must either provide more capital or abandon the family. Yet, in indigenous communities in Ecuador, there are still last remnants of more equal gender relations, where shared inheritance of wealth and land persists, especially in areas where land was not exploited. Traditional norms have also started to equalize ownership as the second generation enjoyed post-colonial land reform, while structures introduced by the state have failed to reproduce patriarchy due to weakness and distance of the government. In most cases, capitalist structures have penetrated, but it is the reproduction of strong cultural norms that have allowed women to maintain their place in these communities. Yet, continued incorporation into the capitalist system through neoliberalism and structural adjustment program first introduced in the 70s continue to threaten